Chapter 61, Truest Friend. Attack, one of the militiamen barked, immediately picking up a spear in one hand and his shield in another. They seemed already prepared to charge at the enemies beneath the domain of Scylla's madness. Silas cursed beneath his breath as he stumbled, retracting his madness. It was something he rarely did, but it seemed appropriate in a situation like this one. He had no choice but to deploy it to save his life, but it had thrown everyone off balance. The militiamen were under orders to protect Olivia as their top priority, and so they were already charging into the forest. Olivia herself was in too much of a daze to call them back. Alex was looking at his bone axe like he might start tongue-fucking it, and Morgan, the sanest of them, was still frozen in place for a moment, struggling to regain his bearings. To make matters worse, Lauren fell to the ground, dropping her weapons and tightening herself up into a ball, a sound that was a cross between a manic laugh and sobbing coming from her. The range of reactions was vaster than Silas would have expected, but the ultimate result was a completely disorganized group right in the middle of an ambush. Without Olivia's skill, Silas couldn't even get an understanding of how many gnolls they were facing, but she was only just regaining her focus. Silas knew he had no choice but to activate madness just now, but he was still frustrated with the outcome, especially since his mind said the smartest thing to do was to activate it again. Right now. He did as his logic guided him, and it wasn't even a moment too soon. Another arrow appeared, but this time, he was ready. He ducked out of the way. Even without less than madness control greater than, the added control madness alone gave him was enough to overturn most disadvantages. He dashed forward, ducking behind trees and quickly changing positions as he rushed after both the militiaman and the apparent location of the archer. If this archer was anything like a sniper, they might already be changing locations. But he had noted a few things. It took time for them to reload. The arrow was on a slight downward trajectory, so they are likely high up in the trees. The second arrow came from an angle, so they likely haven't changed locations just yet. They're targeting me, and though it's not certain that they'll leave the others alone when I start hunting them down, it's the best option I have. If he stood there, trying to protect people he barely knew, he would not only be a sitting duck, but he might even put them in even more danger. He dispelled his madness. He couldn't use it continuously anyway, and as he made some distance between him and the others, it would at least give them a chance. The wind whistled by his face, the humidity of the rainforest mixing with his sweat. Adrenaline pumped through him as his green eyes flickered from side to side, scanning for anything he could come across. Suddenly, his ears twitched, and he ducked and rolled. There. He could feel his senses on high alert. He had felt it before, but the higher his mental anvil became, the sharper they seemed to become. Now that he was actually looking out for a specific sound, he reacted to it instantaneously. The arrow pierced into a tree with such force that its tail vibrated wildly, but Silas had already darted forward again. He seemed to have turned a blind eye to the militiamen who were charging forward. Dash. Lurk, F. Level, 4. Physical, 40. Mental, 42. Will, 47. Dash. Silas' sharp eyes finally spotted the archer. Hidden in the foliage, he surprisingly had two crossbows strapped to his wrists while he wielded a bow that honestly looked one pull away from snapping in two. When Lurk saw that Silas had spotted him, a yellow grin spread across his face as a light far more intelligent than Silas wanted to admit lit his eyes. It's luring me somewhere. Silas' head turned toward the militiamen who were charging in the completely wrong direction and he gritted his teeth. There was no choice. He had to catch Lurk before he could succeed. And even if he did succeed, he had no choice but to fall into this trap. If Lurk could sneak attack them, there was no doubt that he had locked onto their scents already. Even after killing 5 more, the village would still have not just 2 elites and a super elite remaining, but a total of 15 warriors. That could overrun Castlemaine 10 times over. It would be worth the retreat if the rudimentary village had some real defenses, but the walls of that village were no different from a suburban home's fence. It wouldn't work. This is stupid, Silas told himself. Who cared about the village? If the gnolls tried to track him through scent, he would just disappear into the forest. See if they could track him through a sea of beasts as he picked them off one by one. It wasn't like he was tied to the village. He knew the real reason he was doing this, even if he didn't allow his mind to go there. He had been fiercely protective of her his whole life, and it seemed almost 10 years had changed nothing. Those vague memories that resurfaced during his madness comprehension, especially the ones where he laughed at himself for what he would say if he called her to tell her about the summoned Ascension, lingered in his mind for longer than he cared to admit, along with another emotion. Guilt. He didn't even think of her back then, as though she was just some distant, meaningless memory. And yet it hit him like a truck the moment he saw her again. She was the truest friend he had had in his entire life. Even if she laughed in his face, he should have at least picked up a damn phone. Chapter 62, Focus. 400 PS's bonus. Accepting Olivia's arbitrary cost for perfect beast skins that definitely made those high-class armors she was wearing, not saying anything about the fact Olivia had them fight while she and the militiaman did nothing. And now this. Olivia probably thought he had no idea, but if there was one thing Silas wasn't, it was a fool. If the bone axe was worth over 1,000 coins, then the armor Olivia wore was easily worth as much. Paying 50 coins for a beast skin that could make at least 2 or 3 of them was practically spitting in his face. However, he accepted it for a simple reason. He was 100% certain that Kasari hadn't ordered it. Madness. Sudden burst. Less than madness control greater than. The sneering lurk froze. With Silas on the ground and him leaping backward from tree branch to tree branch, there was still at least 20 meters that separated the two, but Silas suddenly became something even more than superhuman. Sudden burst not only allowed him to reach his top speed instantly, but when he really pushed it and didn't deactivate the skill, basking in the stress his body was under, he could feel himself breaking beyond that limit. Under less than madness control greater than, his body didn't rip itself apart, neither did the gene talent run out of control. Instead, the world seemed to slow to a crawl around him, and the entire potential of sudden burst was unearthed until it evolved to something beyond a dexterity skill. In an instant, Silas had cut the distance in half. The effects of sudden burst ran out and he could feel the burning in his body that told him he wouldn't be able to use it again for a while. However, this was enough. A dagger came out from his madness key, and under the plus 150% will and plus 200% charisma that came from madness, the physical of his telekinesis skyrocketed to just over 75. It whistled through the air with a high-pitched screech and impaled Lurk's chest down to the hilt in what felt like an instant. The Gnoll Elite opened his eyes wide, not expecting that this would have happened. However, Silas' mind was on something else entirely. It wasn't just the fact that Lurk had managed to keep his sanity beneath madness effect, but that he had already been spotted. Just as the Gnoll Elite was falling from the trees, another group of 4 gnolls had already spotted Silas. Silas came to a stop. He could feel his body aching beneath the effects of sudden burst, but his mind was still moving like a roaring engine. Despair was the last on the list, and he didn't have the luxury of going through all his emotions one by one. His eyes shifted from the group of gnolls that had been waiting for him to run into the trap to the quiver that had been crushed beneath Lurk's fall. It spilled out with arrows, what must have been about a dozen crudely formed ones. As for the crossbows strapped to his wrists, each one only had a single bolt attached with a not too subtle dripping green liquid on their tips. Now Silas understood why the archer had only sent 3 arrows until now. Lurk had a limited number and even his crossbows were one-time use items. Judging by the bone axe he hid on his back, he probably chose an unorthodox path on purpose. He probably never planned to kill Silas with an arrow. Even with all of these thoughts, Silas was still the first to react. His telekinesis ripped out an arrow from Lurk's quiver and it tore into the forehead of a gnoll. The group hesitated about escaping for only a moment before Silas' madness field enveloped them. It's so much easier. This was the only thought Silas had before another arrow tore through the air. The gnolls reacted better this time, but it still tore through one of their shoulders. They charged towards Silas with madness in their eyes, thoughts of running and reporting flung far to the back of their minds. The distance between them wasn't far to begin with. By the time Silas had ripped out another arrow to use, they were already bearing down on him. His focus shook as he braced himself, and the arrow fell to the ground. Silas cursed again. He could only control one thing with his telekinesis at a time. It required his will, and by obvious extension, his focus. He wasn't sure if he could practice to make it better, but right now obviously wasn't the ideal situation to do so. 3 weapons bore down on Silas from 3 different sides, and he felt a panic awaken in his heart. He had run down the list and finally hit despair. When he could focus on one enemy at a time, everything was perfect. But he was only human. He couldn't calculate his way through the intentions and reactions of 3 separate entities at once. Retreat. That was all he could think of, launching himself backward to try to get out the range of their strikes. The harsh whistling of their weapons cut through the air and whipped against his face with displaced wind. He could practically imagine those blades cutting right into him, and very much human emotions began to bubble up within him. Focus, Silas roared in his mind. A steel-like will forged through decades erupted. It wasn't a mere stat, it was Silas Brown. He accelerated in his retreat, weaving through the trees along a path he had already been through once. He didn't even turn back, his eyes focused on the 3 enraged gnolls that rushed after him. He could feel that less than madness control greater than was already about to run dry. His intelligence was only at 10 and his ether pool was pitifully small as a result. Using this high-level skill for extended periods of time was impossible, but being able to keep out of the range of these enraged gnolls while running backward was impossible without it. He wouldn't have the control needed. Chapter 63, Exhilarating. 300 GTs bonus. Luckily, he already found what he was looking for. A pair of dazed militiamen stood in the distance, seemingly both having snapped out of Silas' madness and realized they were lost. Unfortunately for them, that didn't last long, as Silas' madness enveloped them again. This time, they fell into it even quicker and their eyes turned a blazing sheen of red. They looked around like wild animals. Silas' back smashed into a tree, just barely out of the eyesight of the militiamen, and all they saw was a torrent of infuriated gnolls. The 3 quickly closed the distance on Silas, but the roar of the militiamen came as well. The gnolls looked to be completely focused on Silas, but at that moment, the latter's second dagger appeared out from the madness key and pierced one right through the brows down to the very hilt. The stricken gnoll's eyes dimmed, and it collapsed, tripping up and slowing the forward momentum of the other 2 just as the militiamen rounded the tree. The 2 were suddenly embroiled in battle and the gnolls forgot Silas' existence. Silas, though, didn't forget theirs. His telekinesis ripped the dagger out from the forehead of the dead companion and he took the opportunity of the distraction to rip out the throat of one, circling the dagger back around to stab in the back of the head of the second. He retracted his madness, then broke into a sprint. If he died under the assault of the 2 militiamen, it would probably be the greatest joke he'd never get to tell. Luckily, the militiamen looked around in rage, not understanding why their opponents had suddenly vanished. Then they looked toward one another, suddenly finding the other annoying. It was then that Silas' madness vanished and confusion lit their faces again. Silas' breath came out in heaving gasps. His body ached, his mind felt drained, but his eyes shone like 2 bright gems. Pulling himself out from near death felt so exhilarating. Silas put his hands on his knees, his breathing sounding like a roaring engine in his ears. His lungs were practically screaming for a break and he felt his vision was blurring. It was the kind of fatigue that made a person want to keel over and vomit, only after ripping their lungs out so that the burning would go away. Using sudden burst to the limit had already brought him over that edge, but then he used less than madness control greater than for so long afterward, pulling out every hint of potential he had remaining. It was like he had been in a full sprint for almost a quarter hour. He thought about those corpses he had left behind and felt no small amount of lament. Did he have time to go and get them? Was it safe to? Was there another ambush? Silas didn't choose to make a foolish mistake. He turned back and saw the militiaman in a daze, directly snatched the reward orbs of the 3 dead gnolls, then raised his voice. "We need to go, now." The militiaman blinked in confusion, but Silas' familiar face seemed to snap them out of the daze. They subconsciously nodded and then followed after Silas. Silas sent one last glance toward where Lurk had fallen, feeling for the loss of a Gnoll Elite's reward, but he never hesitated when he made a decision. This was the right thing to do. The 3 returned to where Olivia and the rest had been. They had already recovered, and there seemed to be an argument about what to do. They hadn't even been aware enough to know where Silas had gone and some of them apparently thought he had already deserted. "We need to retreat." Silas said these words and didn't wait for everyone's reaction. Seeing him return with the 2 militiamen, they were rightfully confused. There was some guilt toward their earlier assumptions about him, but Silas didn't blame them for this either. They weren't in their right state of mind, anyway. Just what happened? Olivia asked, quickening to catch up with Silas. At this point, Silas was most definitely not walking. This wasn't the appropriate time for leisure. He was in a jog that his broken body could barely withstand right now. We were attacked. I dealt with it, was how Silas responded. I think you owe us an explanation that's better than that, Morgan chimed in from behind. I don't, actually, Silas said. Inwardly, he was sighing, though. He didn't want to take such a firm stance right now, but there were some lines that had to be drawn. If you want to know what happened, ask them. He pointed over his shoulder at the two militiamen. The group fell into silence. Olivia gave them a questioning look. It was clear that most of the group didn't really treat the militiamen as people. It was easier for them to go about in ignorance that way. That was obviously why they chose to question Silas instead. The two militiamen looked toward one another. We only remember rushing toward where the hidden archer was and getting lost. Then we found 3 gnolls and rushed to fight them, but then they suddenly died under a flying dagger when we engaged them. Flying dagger. They all looked at Silas. Each one had been shocked by Silas' telekinesis. It wasn't something any one of them could do. It wasn't just a matter of having high will and charisma. Silas was pretty sure that it was because he unlocked madness that he likewise unlocked telekinesis, even though the more he learned about the two, the less connected they seemed. And what about the archer? Olivia asked. They never appeared again. She sucked in a cold breath. Didn't that mean that they had to kill at least 9 gnolls in a single trip? But the corpses, Lauren suddenly called out. It's too late, Silas interrupted. This was all planned from the start. The first hunting party already smelled off. When the second one appeared not long afterward, it wasn't a coincidence. They're trying to hunt us down. There might even be another party trying to close in on us right now. Chapter 64, Status Change. There's only 10 of them left. If we return to the village and they track us down, it'll be 11 versus 10. This is the best option. Silas finished. You killed 5. Morgan did the math. Yes, Silas replied coolly. The entire group looked toward Silas' back as they ran, feeling as though they had all run into a monster. This wasn't the movies. Winning against one strong opponent was already impressive enough. You couldn't win against 2 unless you were at least 50% stronger than them both from their experience, let alone 3 or more. Was Silas really one of them? Olivia frowned, feeling that she had lost control of the situation. Silas went and made such a huge decision on his own, and she was fairly certain that the field that disrupted their minds had come from him. Although there was also a large chance it came from the gnolls as well, her senses were sharp. She obviously didn't have just the less than basic scouting greater than skill either. She had to admit that she had bent Casray's rules a little and taken some advantage of Silas, but she had never put his life in danger. It was unacceptable to her for this to happen, and yet, at the same time, she gave Silas more leeway than she would have someone else. Maybe it was because she knew quite clearly that Casrai still had feelings for him and would likely let this matter slide as well. As for Silas, he already knew it was inappropriate. This wasn't his village and yet he had made such an important decision for them, he wasn't naive to that fact. Unfortunately, there also wasn't a choice for propriety. The group moved as fast as they could and this time, it was actually Silas who lagged behind them, his lungs screaming. However, he urged them to keep going and not slow down so they could lessen the potential variables. The group inevitably came across beasts, but this wasn't the time to care about collecting beast pelts, so they directly attacked as a group, skewering the animals from all sides. This slowed them down, but not by much, and soon the village was in sight again as they stepped into the wet marsh. There were 2 guards facing the direction of the rainforest and the gnoll village, likely men of the village. It was clear their only task was to scout and report because the moment the group was seen returning, one of them immediately rushed off to inform the city lord. Soon, Kasari had appeared with the militiamen. There was a tight frown that knitted her brows, as she could already feel that something had gone wrong. Her heart plummeted to the floor when she didn't see Silas among the returnees. Where is Syl? Kasari questioned immediately. She looked at Olivia with a hint of franticness in her eyes that was barely masked by her attempt to keep her composure. Olivia was startled for a moment and looked back. Silas was very tired, and he had been falling further and further behind their pace as they moved. The adventurers looked toward one another. Silas knew the city lord. That was. At that moment, Silas jogged out of the rainforest and into the marsh, his body slick with sweat and his chest heaving. It was only after seeing this that Kasari had to stifle a breath of relief. She immediately moved on as though she hadn't said a word. What happened? Olivia gave her friend some grace and moved on as well, explaining the situation. Kasari bit at her bottom lip as she listened. Knowing that the village would likely be attacked soon put her on edge, even if they had the numbers advantage right now. They would likely have to be on edge and the gnolls might try a night raid. And, from their information, the gnolls were even stronger at night. This also wasn't the modern world anymore. At night, it would practically be pitch black aside from the moonlight. Their scouting wouldn't even be effective. The gnolls would definitely have far sharper vision than them in this case as well. Silas finally caught up. His breathing was ragged just a moment ago, but for some reason, he stood straight and tall now, as though he was just fine. We will have to prepare the village. Kasari regained all of her composure at the same moment. Gather the women, children, and weak near the center. We'll give the men spears, but inform them that they aren't to fight. They're only there for intimidation and to keep up appearances. They will probably try a night raid, so if you can help it, I would suggest resting as much as you can now. This will be dangerous, but it will also be a great opportunity. These two, Olivia was speechless. There was a rush to fulfill Kasari's orders. Silas completed his trade with Olivia and finally learned less than basic scouting greater than. Then, he found a bed and collapsed, his aching body completely forgetting that he had gotten a good night's rest just hours ago. He barely had the time to take a glance at his new look status screen. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage. Level, 0. Titles, A Flexible Will, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, A Patient Stalker, F. Physical, 50. Greater than, Strength, 50. Greater than, Constitution, 50. Greater than, Dexterity, 50. Greater than, Speed, 50. Mental, 47. Greater than, Intelligence, 10. Greater than, Wisdom, 10. Greater than, Charisma, 122. Will, 94. Luck, 1. Skills, Madden Meditation, FF, Madness Control, FF+, Basic Scouting, F. Comprehensions, Madness, FFF, Gene State, Soft. Fragmented Genes, Grimblade Lineage, F8, Dexterity, F6, Constitution, F6, Strength, F. Common Genes, 3, Speed, F3, Strength, F2, Constitution, F3, Dexterity, F. Gene Talents, Blade Aura, Unranked, Sudden Burst, F, Tail Whip, F. There were so many things that Silas noticed immediately, so many surprising things, from two of his titles actually swapping places, to the fact one of those titles didn't seem to have a rank at all, and then the new ranks everything seemed to have gained. But he didn't allow himself to think too much about it. Maybe it was because of his strong will, but he shut those thoughts down, forcing his mind into a blank state where sleep was king. Chapter 65, Overprotective. Cass, we need to talk. Olivia followed in after Kasari, the two entering the shabby shack at the center of the village. Kasari took a seat at the head of her desk, a tight frown on her face. Clearly, the coming battle was weighing heavily on her mind, and Olivia's sudden sternness wasn't really to her liking either. She sighed. Lay it on me. Well, it's not all bad news. There is some good news. Olivia passed over a ring. Simple storage ring, F. Contains hidden space accessible by the mind. Size is dependent on ether units invested with a limit of 10 by 10 by 10 meters. Ether units, 20. Scale, 10 centimeters. Such a large storage device sounded great, but it was unfortunately an F treasure for a reason. The scalability was terrible. An ether unit was the equivalent amount of ether someone with 10 intelligence would have. Meaning, someone with 10 intelligence would have to drain all the ether they had just to increase this ticker by 1. This was fine enough, but the real trouble came in what each unit meant. A single ether unit was worth about an additional 10 centimeters. So Silas, for example, would have to drain himself 20 times just to gain a 2x2 by 2 meter storage space. The worst part was that the invested units were not permanent, as they would dissipate over time. After a day, a ring of this quality could lose about 20% of its size, and that was regardless of how much you invested. Due to that, the two women were actually reluctant to fill it past 20 ether units even if they could. In this world, ether was probably the most valuable resource. They couldn't afford to drain themselves every day just out of convenience. Not everyone had Madden meditation to quickly replenish themselves, and even then, Silas was only able to replenish his ethers so quickly precisely because his intelligence was so low in the first place. These are beasts. Casseray's brows jumped. They don't have the usual signs of wear and tear. They're perfect. How? Casseray smiled bitterly. It was Silas, wasn't it? Olivia pouted. You took all the fun out of it. Couldn't I have had a breakthrough or something? Do you really have so little faith in me? You didn't. Stop. I already know what you're thinking. I paid him. Casseray's eyes narrowed. How much? Olivia coughed. Anyway, the bad news. I think we have to draw some lines in the sand. I understand if you might have some more leniency towards Silas than most others, but today he basically made this choice for us. Casseray leaned back into her chair, taking those words in. Although Olivia didn't explain with any depth, she understood what she meant. Ultimately, this was her city. There was a reason she had made it a point to say that the quest wasn't a charity event, and they would get rewards for their participation. She knew a lot about human nature. Whether or not she or Olivia would have made the same decision, it wasn't Silas' place to unilaterally decide for them. But at the same time, considering the circumstances, was there another choice? How much? Casseray suddenly asked again. Olivia didn't expect this, but in the end, she told the truth. Casseray sighed, rubbing her brows. He didn't even know coins existed until I told him about it. Even if he learns in the future, he won't put two and two together. The events will be separated by too much time. Don't be like that. We're tight on funds, we have to cut corners where we can. Plus, in this world, as cruel as it sounds, he can only blame himself. Casseray shook her head. Everything you said would have made sense. If it wasn't Silas, he definitely already knows. He just didn't bother to call you out on it. Then that's even better. He's not a petty person. Casseray's smile became even more bitter. He's the pettiest person in the world. Don't let that stoic face fool you. He's brattier than you are. I am not bratty, Olivia said with a gasp. As for Casseray's words about Silas, she didn't argue. That was because she remembered that even though Silas knew she was interested in the bone axe, he didn't even talk to her about it, directly selling it to Alex for such a low price. He'll definitely remember this. Take the initiative to give him an extra 600. No, actually, we'll let him use the Nexus. Olivia's eyes widened. Cass, you. There was a smile on Casseray's face and she didn't even seem to be listening to Olivia anymore. Was she surprised about Silas killing an F+ elite, then slaughtering 5 gnolls including another elite on his own? Not really. She just felt that it was typical Silas. She had never thought about it so clearly, but there was never a doubt in her mind that he would have clicked yes to enter this world. And once he did, he would definitely excel. And most importantly, she saw something that Olivia didn't. He definitely didn't have to go after those 5 gnolls. He did it for her. He was still the same Silas. Still as overprotective as ever. Silas' eyes shot open. He only should have slept for an hour or two, but he felt that his body was feeling much better. He had already had a good night's rest, and this nap had more than made up for his aching body. If he had had a large meal, it would have replaced it quite easily. Unfortunately, he had traded away the beasts he defeated. There's time between now and the night. There's a good 8 hours. I can go hunting, or I can use my coins to exchange for something if they don't let me leave. They had left barely after dawn, and it should only be around noon now. Assuming they attacked at night like everyone thought they would, there was definitely time. However, Silas set aside his hunger. He hadn't forgotten that he had gathered many rewards. Chapter 66, Spoils. He still had the Gnoll Elite's gene core even though he hadn't gotten anything from Lurk, and he had the reward orbs of 3 more Gnolls on top of that. But Silas was a bit hesitant. The reason he didn't absorb Vorjak's genes was because, unlike with the madness key, he couldn't directly pass genes from himself to the gene crystal. This seemed to be a unique ability the madness key was capable of, but the gene crystal could only absorb fresh genes. This wasn't actually entirely bad. That was because the gene crystal could absorb genes with a 100% success rate, so there would be no loss. However, the drawback was obviously that any genes he gave the gene crystal, he couldn't take in himself. Dvorak had 2 common will and 3 common intelligence genes. Only intelligence was needed for unlocking basic etherflow, but he needed a whole 15 of them. These 3 would obviously go a long way to helping that. Unfortunately, he couldn't pick and choose which he took. It was either he tried to absorb all 5, or he took in none of them. That also meant that the gene crystal would directly discard the 2 common will genes and they would vanish. That was a plus 4 will gone into the wind. That was a huge amount, almost 50% of Scylla's current stat total. In base, that would be a whole plus 5 to my telekinesis strength. If I added plus 150% when madness is activated, that would be an additional plus 25 strength just from those 2 genes alone. Of course, I also have to consider that the odds I succeed in absorbing both of them are only 25% considering my soft gene state only gives me a 50-50 chance. The hardest thing to ignore is the potential boost to my intelligence. Madness control runs out too quickly. If I could use it for longer. What made all of this harder was the fact Scylla's had lost a null elite corpse. If he had 2 of these gene cores, it would have been an easier choice to make. But scarcity made it more difficult. On the one hand, he needed more immediate strength. But on the other, he needed to improve his future potential as well. Let's check the other stuff first to see if it'll tip things one way or another. Scylla's took out the reward orbs of the 3 nulls, crushing them one after another. Between the 3 of them, he gained a total of 50 coins. Coins. 220 F. Then there came the gene cores. Common gene, 3, strength, F, 3, constitution, F, common gene, 3, strength, F, 3, constitution, F, common gene, 3, strength, F, 3, constitution, F, they were identical down the line, and also equally as disappointing. Scylla's ended up using 2 to feed the gene crystal, and as a result he wasted 1 strength gene and 1 constitution gene. There was no way to split genes, and basic etherflow only needed 5 strength and constitution genes, so the 6th of each was dissipated. Or so he thought. The madness key vibrated and the dissipating energy was suddenly sucked into it. Scylla's felt something change, but he wasn't sure what it was. He looked inside the madness key and suddenly understood. The space inside had gotten bigger. From a 1 cubic meter space, it had become a 3 cubic meter space. That wasn't all, either. When he used his intention to connect with the madness key, he felt like he was staring at those dancing snakes, each one completing a different sort of action. Is this what happens when I overfeed the madness key? He had never tested it out, and why would he? Genes were precious even if he had reached the stat cap. But he never expected that the madness key would have these hidden abilities. Could he use it to improve his madness comprehension, then? Right now, the insights were still much weaker than the barriers within the dungeon, but if he fed it more that would change, no. He looked at the last null gene core he had and chose to take a gamble. It wasn't like he could increase his stats right now, anyway. The madness key greedily swallowed. The space inside grew once more, from 3 cubic meters all the way to 9 cubic meters. It was a shocking change. This size could already dwarf a small cabin or house, and it was much more space that Scylla's even knew what to do with currently. Still not enough, Scylla's thought. This was, indeed, a game changer. According to his new scouting skill, Madness Control was an FF plus rated skill while Madness was an FFF rated comprehension. Scylla's could still remember how his comprehension had helped less than little madness greater than and the other madness skills to reach legendary mastery in a single bound. He felt that it could be able to do the same for less than madness control greater than, but the problem was that it was a much higher tier skill. Essentially, increasing his madness comprehension now was akin to killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Madness comprehension was now at common mastery while less than madness control greater than was still at fragmented, but if the former rose to bronze mastery, he had a feeling that less than madness control greater than would rise with it. And, an increase in madness would raise the boost his telekinesis gained when it was activated, and thus be worth far more than any boostable stats could give him, while an increase in less than madness control greater than mastery would make his intelligence stretch further. With this thought in mind, Silas made his decision. He passed the 3 intelligence genes to the gene crystal, knocking down the 15 he needed to 12. The madness key acted again, absorbing the 2 latent genes, and its size expanded again. Unfortunate, Silas sighed. The space grew to 10 cubic meters, then stopped. There should have been enough to grow to 11, but it didn't do so. Instead, the rest of the energy was infused into the walls, but it still wasn't enough to surpass the barriers. Though, he could feel that it was already about 90% similar in strength. Silas had a feeling that if he wanted to go beyond common mastery, he would need to allow the madness key to absorb bronze genes. That seemed to be the adequate trade. Still, he didn't regret the gamble. That was because he felt something else stirring. Less than madness control greater than. Chapter 67, Effectiveness. 350 GT's bonus chapter. He remembered that while madness and less than madden meditation greater than were both at common mastery, less than madness control greater than was certainly not. Having the madness key around his neck felt far more intimate than observing the barriers had been. It didn't flicker in and out, and he felt that he could be immersed in his own thoughts and under its influence at the same time. Madness Control, FF+ skill. Your body is your temple and it listens to no commands other than your own. Plus Dexterity. He focused in on that plus dexterity. The more he came to know about this world, the more he understood that things weren't always as they seemed. There were obviously some things, often hidden in plain sight, that were obscured maybe by design, maybe maliciously, or maybe both. There was no reason for the grades of his skills and such to be hidden. The idea of simplicity made no sense. The human race was an intelligent enough one to understand a simple 9-tiered system from F to FFF+. But as with everything in this world, information was at a premium. They distracted you with genes and fancy stats and ether, when in reality nothing was more important than the information surrounding them itself. And he felt that this was another piece of wool over his eyes. He looked down at the madness key. This thing could give him the answer to any question he wanted, and yet there were so many weird things surrounding it. There was that odd glitch in the system, then there was him magically losing 3 months of time, and for what? Because there were certain things he shouldn't be allowed to know. Even for the madness key, when he asked a question that he shouldn't, he was directly punished for it. There were big players in this world, a world that was suddenly far vaster than he was used to. Efficiency, Silas suddenly thought. No, effectiveness. Silas' mind suddenly drifted to a thought, linking 2 seemingly unrelated things together. He had lost one of his daggers, but there was still one that remained. Simple dagger, F. Level, 1. +3 strength. Ability, pierce. Makes applied strength doubly as effective. Durability, 10 out of 10. That word, effective, was capitalized, much like strength was. Why? What is effectiveness? Effectiveness is a hidden variable stat. It acts as a multiplier to your stats, ranging from 0.0 to 1.0. Though, some special methods can push it beyond those measures, sometimes at a cost. Its purpose is in deciding how effectively your stats, skills, or comprehensions are being applied. Silas's eyes narrowed. A hidden stat, and by its description, it was probably the most important stat there was. But it made sense. What did having 50 strength even mean? Could he exert the same strength with a fist as he could a kick? Of course not. The latter would always be stronger. Would he be able to run at the same speed on grass while barefoot versus if he had a pair of cleats? Again, of course not. Even so, he felt that the purpose of the hidden stat was more complicated than just those obvious examples. It probably took into things like technique, how trained his actions were, how well he shifted his weight in battle, how good the defenses of his opponent were. The number of factors was endless, and Silas suddenly understood why it was hidden. At least it made more sense that this stat was hidden as opposed to the 9 grades. Such a number would wildly fluctuate so quickly in battle that no human, not even Silas, could possibly read and react to them. What would even be the point in seeing it? Unless you had a skill capable of taking control of those variables, putting yourself in a perfect state at all given times. Suddenly, it clicked. If he was going around with a 0.1 effectiveness, but less than madness control greater than could raise it to 0.2, it would be as good as doubling all suddenly, it clicked. If he was going around with a 0.1 effectiveness, but less than madness his physical stats instantly. It was no wonder this skill was the result of the fusion of those three. Your understanding of less than madness control greater than has deepened, less than madness control greater than has reached common mastery, madness control, FF+, skill. Your body is your temple and it listens to no commands other than your own. Plus 0.1 effectiveness. The change felt lackluster, especially when even a trashy dagger could double the effectiveness of strength. But Silas felt that this small change might be worth far more than he knew. Pierce could only work in conjunction with the strength stat, but this applied to an overall change, a synergy of sorts. Stats, in general, felt like they had quite some overlap. For example, just simple physics, wasn't speed often correlated with strength? And what about acceleration? If you were given little room in battle, and needed to explode with a lot of power in a short time, wouldn't you need dexterity? Would strength alone be able to do it? And what about when your attack landed? Would you prefer if your fist was as elastic as a bouncy ball or as tough as iron? If you chose the latter, wouldn't you need a high constitution? Everything fed into one another, and an overall increase of 0.1 effectiveness was more like 0.4 when it was evenly applied across his stats, another 0.14 when he activated a gene talent, and then another 0.14 when he used his ether. They would all steamroll into one another, layering and strengthening. Silas wouldn't be surprised if his overall battle prowess had suddenly taken a huge leap forward. The flaps of the large tent suddenly opened, letting some sunlight in. "Ah, you're awake," Lauren said with a pleasant hint in her voice. "The city lord asked to see you." "Oh, all right," Silas nodded, standing to his feet. He kind of wanted to take another shower, but it was more inconvenient now with everyone out and about. The bronze stele had a diameter of 100 meters and a population cap of 100 as well. This common rudimentary village, though, had half that. It was the middle of the day and everyone was rushing to prepare for tonight. He didn't have the luxury, so he could only deal with it. Silas thanked Lauren for delivering the message and made his way to the core of the city before being escorted by a militiaman into a shabby shack where both Olivia and Kassarai were waiting. Chapter 68, City Lady. The first thing Silas did after giving the two women a nod was take a glance around. The shack was simple, just a desk, a bed, and what looked like a barrel used for simple baths. It was all completely normal except for one object. A floating cube glowed a dull grey color, hovering above an altar in the corner of the small shack. It could only be one thing. City Stele, Silas thought to himself. His brows raised. This was definitely not an area you should casually allow anyone to enter. These two were probably the only ones who knew that the City Stele was located here. Technically speaking, Silas only had to put his hands on it to trigger a conquer sequence. Silas' brows lowered, and he looked toward Kassarai. Olivia's jaw almost hit the floor. Is that a smile? It definitely was. She hadn't known Silas for long, but even Morgan cracked a quirk of the lip or two at Alex's antics. Silas himself almost pretended as though he hadn't heard anything at all. Well, calling it a smile was probably pushing it. Silas' expression just seemed to be a hint warmer than the stone cold she had become used to. "Silas, you're here?" Kassarai nodded. "That's good. I heard from Olivia that you helped us gather up some very important strategic resources, so I wanted to make sure that you were properly compensated for your efforts." Oh, Silas didn't seem too surprised by this. He felt that this was an expected outcome. Kassarai rolled her eyes. "Can't you react with some gratitude? Maybe an, oh my, city lady, you're so generous." Same Silas, pretending as if he knew everything. Silas gave an exaggerated formal bow. "You're right, the esteemed city lord has done me a great service." "City lady," Kassarai corrected. "There's no such term in history." Silas stood to his full height again and replied without missing a beat. Well, City Lord wasn't an official historical title either, but she didn't need to know that. Who cares? My city, my rules. Your rudimentary village, you mean? You trying to pick a fight, Silas? If you want one. Kassarai looked both irritated and amused at the same time. She never understood people who said Silas wasn't funny. his words themselves were, it was just that delivery was almost too quick and lacked flair. Olivia looked back and forth between the two and suddenly let out a sigh. Holy shit, I completely misread this situation. Silas and Kasari looked at her at the same time with accusatory glances that seemed to say, what's that supposed to mean? Olivia held up her hands in surrender, not even quite knowing what she was apologizing for. Kasari cleared her throat. Anyway, like I was saying, we appreciate your efforts. We spoke about it and think that a good reward is giving you access to the Nexus. Nexus? Silas asked. It's a hub you can access through a city stele or during quick-time events in the wilderness. It's essentially a place you can pay for information, form connections and, maybe most importantly, access the system store. One of the perks of being a budding city lady. Silas' brows raised again. What are these quick-time events? Has your head been buried in the sand for the last 3 months? Silas spread out his hands. I've been occupied by some things. Not occupied by getting armor or better weapons than, she looked toward the dirtied and bloody wraps still tightly wound around his hands, wrists, and forearms. Whatever those are. Anyway, quick-time events are like open-air dungeons. In this region, they basically happen once a month. Leveled beasts are usually hard to find outside of those events, unless you're risking your life and adventuring particularly deep into the forest. Those that reach a certain threshold during the event can usually access a nexus afterward. But you have perpetual access to one, Silas said as less of a question and more of a statement. Yes, and no, Kasari started before being interrupted. Kasari waved a hand and told Olivia not to mind it. Not all city ladies have access to a nexus, and the one we have access to is gated. Technically, the quick-time event nexuses are gated as well, depending on the difficulty and your performance, but they tend to be lesser than ours. This is all to say that what you can buy through our nexus is very limited. Okay, I understand. Then feel free, Kasari pointed a finger toward the city stele. So long as you help us to gather more intact beast furs, you can use it whenever you need it. Just keep it under 500 coins. Silas nodded and didn't say anything as he made it to the city stele, sinking his mind into it. He immediately saw several options. View city status. Conquer city stele. Enter nexus. He chose the last option, and his mind was warped into a white space. On the outside, Olivia sighed. Tell me the truth, lady, what elixir did he force-feed you? Huh. You're a little too trusting, don't you think? He feels more powerful than us all and that's without all the easy access you're giving him. I know him, Kasari said, somewhat defensively. Olivia raised an eyebrow as though she were looking at a crazy person. She really wanted to say, no, you know the Silas of 10 years ago, not this one, but she bit back her statement. It was hard not to feel like a third party getting in the way of a love affair right now. All things considered, she had only known Kasari for 3 months. However, in that time, they had truly had each other's backs. They had gone through true life or death events when either one of them would have already had the opportunity to backstab or betray the other. Olivia, likely rightfully so, felt that that was worth far more than whatever childhood love Kasari had experienced. Chapter 69, Leaderboard. You never really knew a person until they were painted into a corner. There were married couples who had experienced decades with one another that didn't truly know the other half, and this wasn't even that. While she understood that this was Kasari's city, they couldn't have gotten to this point without the efforts of both of them. In addition, if anything were to happen to the city, it wouldn't just be Kasari who was put in danger, or just the villagers she still didn't know were real or not, but Olivia as well who would potentially be thrown into the mess. It was hard to feel like Kasari wasn't gambling with all of their lives based on the memory of a person she once knew, and a person she clearly had a blind spot for as well. Silas had just unveiled something that could barely be considered a smile, and all of Kasari's promised sternness had gone out the window. Olivia exhaled a breath. Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't very professional in this matter and I cut corners where I shouldn't have. But, this little village is basically our make or break. We have to be more cautious with it. Kasari blinked, seemingly coming to understand Olivia's perspective. Earlier today, Silas had made a unilateral decision for them, and now it seemed that she was raining rewards on him for that. At the same time, Her image as a city lord was also highly important to her popularity amongst her citizens. Scylla's was a variable that could easily throw that in the wrong direction if things were handled inappropriately. Kasari shook her head. Olivia, what happened today? I already told you. Tell me again. Olivia frowned, but wanting to know what Kasari meant, she did so anyway. There, Kasari stopped her barely a few seconds in. An arrow came out of nowhere and your mind suddenly became fuzzy. Then Scylla's ran. Some of you assumed that he had escaped alone, but then he came back. You're failing to bridge two important things. Olivia parted her lips to respond, but stopped, waiting for Kasari to continue. The assumption that he ran away isn't a bad one, because it's what any smart person would have done in that situation. All of you were tied down, and he was seemingly the only one who could move, so why didn't he? The arrows were targeting him, though, Olivia countered. They were, but if he ran away from the archer instead of toward them, what would have happened? Olivia's eyes widened. Kasari shook her head. No, it's not your fault. You're smart, smarter than me, that's for sure. I just shouldn't have told you that story. It colored your perception of him and clouded your judgment. I know I told you not to let it go beyond these four walls, but we're all human, aren't we? A bitter smile spread across her lips. She did regret telling that story. She had held it in for 10 years, so what was another 10? Unfortunately, she couldn't bottle up spilled milk, and it would be hard to mend the relationship between the two. The short of it is that I want to nip this in the bud right now, Liv. Don't trust Scylla's because I happen to know him 10 years ago, trust him based on what he's already done. That is enough. Olivia exhaled a breath. All right. Ellipsis. Scylla's couldn't hear what the women were talking about, and they probably knew that, which was why they didn't bother to hide their voices at all. His mind was sent into a realm of sorts. It was yet another world of white fog, one that reminded him a lot of the first place he had entered when the trial began. He moved his intention, and suddenly the world began to zoom around him. Soon, he found himself in a city with buildings that were somehow both simple and yet far more substantial than the ones he was used to on Earth. There weren't any skyscrapers, nor outlandish architecture, but it felt like the city planning was designed by a person with decades more experience than modern Earth, not to mention the funds to do so. He didn't know why he got that feeling. He had only seen what was objectively a small part of this city. The city he was now seeing was mostly deserted, but it was the feeling he got, nonetheless. This must be the gathering place Kasari mentioned, but as expected, there aren't any people here. Or maybe there are people, but they're so spread out within the city that I can't immediately spot any one of them. Scylla's was about to pull back when his eyes landed on something. High up in the skies, there was a board visible from seemingly all angles, and upon it there were 3 columns, one of which was completely empty. Leveling leaderboard. 1. Kale Darkmane level 9. 2. Astrid Grimblade level 9, 3. Thorn Ravenclaw level 9, 4. Malachi Grimblade level 9, 5. Lucius Grimblade level 9, 6. Draven Ravenclaw level 9, 7. Asher Darkmane level 8, 8. Ragnar Ravenclaw level 8, 9. Brack Smith level 6, 10. Hilda Silverden level 6. Scylla's eyes narrowed. Those names. Their last names had changed, but all of them had been on the list of flights he checked that day. The top 8 was completely controlled by the Browns, the Abadi, and the Rouse. Or, rather, the Grimblades, the Darkmanes, and the Ravenclaws. The gap between them and 9th and 10th place also seemed to be quite substantial. A part of Scylla's thought that they would have hung around at level 0 like he did. Or was it that their starting genes limits were so much better that it was unnecessary? Scylla's thought about what it would take for him to finally leave level 0. Part of him wanted to hold out until he could form a legendary gene and really go all out. But was that realistic? Chapter 70, Categories. 800 PS's bonus. He had been lucky to get his hands on the gene crystal, but even that would only allow him to form a bronze gene at best, and that would, only, raise his stat limit from 50 to 100. It was likely that the Grimblades without diluted bloodlines like his own had already started off with a similar stat limit, which was why they left behind level 0 so quickly. He mulled it over for a moment, looking at that leaderboard. But he eventually shook his head. He would focus on satiating the gene crystal first, then he could worry about everything else. Who knew? Maybe by then he'd have another chance to take advantage of. City leaderboard. 1. Castlemaine. 2. Dark Cellar. 3. The Enclave. 4. Look at me, Mom. I'm famous. 5. Gandalf's Pass. 6. Dragon's Lair. 7. Rune Haven. 8. Steinsburg. 9. Euphoria. 10. The Sword in the Stone. Looking at this list of names, Silas didn't find them funny. In fact, he found it all to be quite sad. He could imagine the thought process of many of these people. Some of them had probably thought it was a joke, some of them feeling like they were in a silly dream until things suddenly became very real. There was a clear contrast between the people on the leveling leaderboard and the people on the city leaderboard. The Grimblades had yet to establish their city. They were using the trial to not only decide which of the three of them would become the city lord, but also as an opportunity to scout for the perfect location. Silas would assume that the other powerful families were much the same. The people on the city leaderboard, however, were the commoners, the people who knew nothing about this coming summoned Ascension and had probably been forced to plop their cities down wherever they happened to spawn at. The silly names they had chosen when contextualized like that made the reality all the more striking. Just what was the point of all of this? If the human race was willing to go so far and even eliminate the visible differences between them so thoroughly, why not go further? Why hadn't they spent the last couple of centuries training everyone for this coming moment? Why hadn't it been taught in schools and lectured about every day? In the end, there was really only one answer to that, and it was as obvious as the 10 names that claimed supremacy on the leveling leaderboard. Silas shook his head. He couldn't say that he had a bleeding heart about the matter, but he didn't like to be controlled. His madness comprehension had made him shed a bit of his pretentiousness. He knew quite well that he just wanted power of his own. I guess we'll see, Silas thought in silence. Between you all and I, whose methods will finally break this streak of failure. Silas had once again returned to a world of white fog and soon found a panel hovering before him. Upon it, there was a list of categories, everything from skills to genes. At the bottom, there was a counter. Coins, 23,478 F. These coins were obviously the resources of Castlemaine. By entering the Nexus like this, he was obviously seen as acting on Casray's behalf, and as such, he wasn't using his own store of coins. That was why Cassarai had mentioned the 500 coin limit. While 500 coins seemed insignificant compared to Casray's current wealth, Silas didn't feel it was inappropriate for her to limit him so much. For one, she didn't owe him all of her wealth. That was ridiculous. Second, she had a village to run. These coins were probably a lifeline in a true crisis, not to mention a bedrock for her future plans. Silas paid more attention to the store itself, perusing the various categories. He quickly came to understand what Cassarai meant by how limited the Nexus was. It seemed that the highest quality items that could be traded for were at the F level. There weren't even any Fs or F+, S, let alone anything beyond. That said, it wasn't all bad. It wasn't as though he had the funds to splurge. At least in this one case, Olivia had told the truth. Less than basic scouting greater than did, indeed, cost 100 coins, and all such F-skills were around that price. Silas thought about what he needed and pretty much immediately thought of two things, his martial arts, and his telekinesis. For the former, he felt that he was getting more and more used to the flow of battle, but most of what he did relied on his mind recalling the boxing and MMA matches he liked to watch and trying to copy the techniques of those men and women. Thanks to his will and his high dexterity, not to mention the added control over his body that less than madness control greater than madness gave him, he had great success with this. But for some reason, he kept feeling like he was close to something while sensing that so-called flow of battle, and yet even after going through his fair share of battles by now, he hadn't really been able to grasp it. It could be that he was just being impatient, but time also wasn't something he had the luxury of wasting, especially since he had apparently lost 3 months already. As for his telekinesis, between now and when he finally succeeded in awakening basic etherflow, he felt that he needed much more practice with it. At the very least, he wanted to be able to move freely and use his telekinesis at the same time without it feeling so awkward. It seems like what I want is pretty straightforward, but it's actually far more abstract than not, Silas thought to himself. What I don't want is a particular skill, but rather something that can better help me to maximize those abilities first. Silas didn't have a lot of ether, he couldn't just load up on skills. Less than madness control greater than was enough to leave him on empty. Stocking up on others would be foolish. Of all the categories, he didn't expect to find something interesting in titles. Chapter 71. 75 GT's bonus. The titles category didn't allow you to buy titles, but rather allowed you to buy introductions to titles. Essentially, it would be a guide to teach you how to unlock certain titles. Common Arts Enthusiast F. You are a jack of all, master of none. However, your efforts have given your style of combat a unique flair and an air of unpredictability that strikes fear in your enemies. +1 Dexterity. Plus 10% success in absorbing related genes. Cost, 300 F coins. After looking around for a while, this was what called out to Silas the most. But would it really help him? So what if he unlocked this title? It could only impact his immediate stats, not his overall situation. Plus, he had already reached his stat cap. He doubted a title would change that. On the other hand, this title seemed to perfectly describe what he was looking for. In addition, it was more expensive than the others by 3 times. Assuming the system was a fair arbitrator, this probably meant something. Silas narrowed his eyes and continued looking. Soon, he found something for his telekinesis in yet another unexpected place. This time, it was actually the elixir section. Sleight of Palms, F. Drink this elixir and gain the enlightenment of truly independent hands. Whether for the purposes of increasing your skill in concocting, or in dual-wielding weapons, rise to an all-new level. +1 Wisdom. Cost, 300 F coins. Silas obviously wasn't concocting anything, nor did he need to dual-wield weapons when he couldn't wield one weapon at all, let alone 2. However, the description intrigued him. That was exactly what using his telekinesis felt like. It was like he was trying to learn the piano again, trying to play quarter notes with one hand and eighth notes with the other, or like he was trying to draw a circle with one hand and a square with the other at the same time. What he was especially curious about was the +1 wisdom that came with the elixir. Could that be just an unrelated side effect? Or was it that the higher his wisdom was, the easier it would be to split his attention and do multiple things with his body and telekinesis at the same time? Silas mulled it over, checking over the whole store diligently. But he really didn't find anything else that was worth the gamble. There were other things that were marginally or somewhat related, but nothing that truly called to him. The 2 were over budget by 100 coins, but he did have 220 coins left over, so he could cover it. In the end, he felt that these 2 were the smartest decision he could make, so he traded for them and pulled away from the Nexus. Common Arts Enthusiast F. Unlock requirements. Greater than perform 1000 kicks. Greater than perform 1000 punches. Greater than complete 10 fluid attack transitions progress. 223 1000ths kicks. 578 1000ths punches. 2/10ths fluid attack transitions. Silas was a bit surprised, so much so that he didn't immediately interact with Kassarai and Olivia. He had already completed that many. Setting aside what a fluid attack transition was, he didn't expect that he would have already used his body to such a degree already. Though maybe it made sense. Those sounded like high numbers, but because he was stuck with using his body as a weapon, his strikes were far less potent than someone using a sharp blade. His battles, as a result, required many more strikes for him to complete, though he usually had better stats than the enemies he was facing off against. Even to defeat a beast with 30 physical, he'd probably need a few dozen strikes, so maybe this wasn't too surprising. But what is a fluid attack transition? He was going to ask the madness key when he remembered where he was and looked up. Right, I spent an extra 100 over budget. Here, Silas extended a hand toward Kassarai. She hesitated somewhat, because she was really thinking of saying it wasn't a big deal. But in the end, she chose to just keep things as professional as possible as that they could get past these speed bumps. The 2 shook hands and Silas' 220 coins fell to 120. Not long after, Silas left, saying his goodbyes. He was completely focused on trying to take advantage of what he had just gained. Olivia raised an eyebrow as he left, but Kassarai waved a hand. Don't mind it. He's like that when he finds something that interests him. I'm going to have to get used to you making excuses for him now, huh? Kasari rolled her eyes. Focus on the preparations. We still have a lot to do. Ellipsis. Silas returned to the large tent, ignoring everything around him and sliding into the bottom bunk of his bed with a focused expression. He took out the one dagger he had remaining. Although he thought of trading for more, he didn't want to waste his coins until he understood exactly what room he had for improvement first. The title was a bit more difficult to get a handle on immediately, so he took out the potion instead. Then he downed it. He paid attention to what was happening within him very closely, also trying to see if there were any changes to the dagger he was controlling in front of him. The elixir tasted almost like a slightly bitter wine. It had a hint of kick to it, and that came with a slight burning sensation down his throat as well. Then came a rush. Silas didn't drink coffee, but from how people described it, he felt that it might very well be similar. It was like his mind was suddenly more alert, but in a subtle sense. It was more like his brain fog had cleared up just a little bit and he had more motivation to do things he otherwise wouldn't want to. The feeling persisted and Silas checked his wisdom to find that it had indeed increased from 10 to 11. Chapter 72, Visualization. The feeling was ultimately extremely subtle, and he couldn't glean anything more from just this. So, he tried moving the dagger around some more. He controlled the dagger to move in a circle while he tried to draw a square with one of his fingers in the air. Silas' green irises brightened. He could actually do it. But this wasn't too difficult for him. Compared to boxing where he was mostly an amateur, he was quite a high-level pianist. He felt that he should have already been capable of doing this. The question was whether he could really control the dagger like a secondary version of him or not. Even with his experience as a pianist, he had found controlling the dagger, or multiple daggers at once, too taxing in battle. He raised his other hand, trying to draw a square with one, a triangle with the other, and a circle with the dagger. Silas' eyes narrowed. He could feel himself running into a bit of a bottleneck. If he did so really slowly, he could just barely manage it. This is progress. I don't think I would have been able to do this before drinking the elixir. But does that mean I'll have to drink more of them to succeed? There didn't seem to be a limit on how many he could drink, but they were obviously expensive. He didn't have enough left to buy even one, let alone multiple. Silas suddenly had a thought. When he was controlling the arrow to kill the gnolls, he had remembered feeling that it was so much easier. Why was that? The obvious reason is that these aren't flying daggers I'm using. They're meant to be wielded by the hand and so they're not balanced that way. Silas' frown deepened. He felt that he was onto something. The difference between before and after the elixir felt like he was approaching a problem from a new angle. It made him think of a very important question. How did his telekinesis work, exactly? Not the underlying mechanisms. Those were probably beyond his current self to grapple with. But rather, how did it manifest? Did he think of a hand wrapping around an object and control it that way? Was he taking control of some intrinsic part of the item and gifting it his will to control itself? Was his telekinesis more like a law of physics, akin to something like gravity except working in any direction he so chose? The more Silas thought about it, the more he realized that he could think of a ton of potential mechanisms through which telekinesis might work, but he had never really consciously realized which one he was using. He just did it without much thought. Which one? It feels like when I use telekinesis, the object becomes imprinted into my mind like a memory, and I manipulate it by transforming that memory, but that feels too abstract, not to mention extremely taxing. Silas frowned. Whenever he used telekinesis, accuracy was never a problem. He could always bring an object to exactly the location he wanted, and he had never had to practice that. That was why his dagger, or arrow in some cases, always struck true. Of course, so long as it was within his 20-meter range. Now he realized that the reason for this accuracy was due to this memory imprinting process. He reflected not only the object in his mind, but the environment it was in as well. Is that how it's supposed to work? Silas thought to himself. Let's try and simplify it, maybe. Silas tried stripping it down, removing all the extra steps and frilly bits until he was down to nothing more than a thin, barely perceptible energy connecting himself and this dagger. The dagger trembled. This is terrible. That was the first thing Silas thought. When it was stripped of that innate visualization he was doing, it felt like he was trying to use his left hand to write. Or it would have, had he not been ambidextrous. When he rebuilt that visualization again, the dagger stopped trembling and was as steady as a stone statue. In that case, why not try imagining myself in the visualization as well? The only thing missing from the memory he was imprinting was himself, but that made sense. He couldn't see himself, he could only feel himself. But if he used his proprioception, an innate sixth sense everyone had for the position of their limbs, it should be possible. Silas slowly got out of his bed, moving as he carried the dagger around with him. He found that the feeling was awkward, but not as awkward as it had been to try to draw three shapes at the same time. And yet, he was certain that this was the far more difficult feat. Ever since he learned to walk, he had already gotten used to just doing things with his body. He didn't think about how to walk or how to run, he just did it. But taking a step back, didn't he envision those fighters while he was in battle and try to emulate them? Instead of taking that extra step, why not just trying to envision himself? Silas sent out a punch. It was tight, and the form was good, but it was nothing amazing. What was amazing, though, was the dagger floating beside him that made the motion of a hook even though his punch was a jab. He pulled back his hand and sent a hook with his left. The dagger moved at the same time in the motion of an uppercut. The more Silas moved, the faster he became. The dagger was like an extension of himself, moving with his thoughts as fluidly as his body itself. His leg whipped out, and the dagger followed an arc coming from the opposite side, as though he had sent out two roundhouse kicks at the same time. Just when it seemed like he would pierce his own foot, they both came to a stop, his foot and the dagger hovering just a few inches from each other. Chapter 73, Rotten. I don't think I can control a second dagger with this level of fluidity. At least not without increasing my wisdom more. But I will be able to soon. Silas lowered his leg, feeling content with just the one dagger for now. With this unequipable scorned wraps on his hand, he was highly limited. Telekinesis would have to bridge that lack of ability for him. With that completed, Silas wanted to turn his attention back to the common art enthusiast title, but a commotion caused his ears to twitch first. He rushed out of the tent to find militiamen shouting out warnings. The tent that the quest takers were lodged in was close to the gate, so Silas saw it immediately. Not that it would have mattered, considering the fact the village was about 50 meters from end to end. He would have definitely seen it, anyway. Although it couldn't be considered a stampede, it was definitely a tide of sorts. Half a dozen wolf beasts with rotten flesh and blood-stained fur charged toward the village. Silas' eyes narrowed. It couldn't be a coincidence. There was no way Castlemaine was this unlucky. He didn't believe that this was unrelated to the gnolls. Rotten wolf, F. Level, 6. Physical, 58. Mental, 0, will, 0. The creatures were grotesque. Standing at 2 meters tall, they were covered in what could only be described as patches of black fur. Everywhere there wasn't this fur, there were ghastly open wounds reeking of pus and disease. And yet, nothing about this seemed to slow their steps in the slightest. They had only just cleared the forest line, but had already cleared the remaining distance by half, with the only part of them not affected by the rot, those glistening silvery claws, tearing up the wet grassy lands in their wake. Silas moved first, leaping over the weak wooden fences without a word. The ends of his scorned wraps and his black hair danced in the wind as he accelerated. The village didn't have any defenses, and by now, the villagers had already been evacuated to the core of the territory. However, there were hardly any better defenses there, either. The best defense there was were the warriors themselves, and whether it was Silas, the militiamen, or the other quest takers, they had all already jumped to action. Silas immediately got the attention of the wolves, their eerie green eyes pulsing with malice as they focused on him. When he saw this, Silas, who had been charging right at him, suddenly took a hard turn to the left, sprinting full tilt perpendicular to their path. As expected, the wolves almost immediately went after him. After seeing their zero mental and will, Silas already understood that these were unintelligent creatures. Even if they had been sent here, the kind of orders they could take would be extremely limited. 6 rotten wolves chased after Silas and they quickly gained on him, their speed clearly superior. The stomach-churning scent of corpses filled the air. As the wolves moved, their pot Filled tongues hung from their mouths and their bodies leaked foul liquids from seemingly every orifice. The lead wolf closed in, its saliva pooling as it felt close to biting Scylla's head off. Suddenly, Scylla's dagger flashed, arcing through the air. He couldn't visualize a target he couldn't see. He was currently in a full sprint away from the pack of wolves, so it was impossible for him to likewise have eyes on their exact locations. As such, under normal circumstances, he would only be able to wildly flail with the dagger. However, these wolves were highly unintelligent. They didn't know how to work together, and the moment they started chasing after him, they didn't do so as a pack, rather, they did so as competitors vying for a piece of meat. They were practically running on top of one another, jostling for position with their shoulders and snapping jaws. So when Scylla sensed a hot and acrid breath to his back, his dagger shot straight and true directly behind him with only one purpose. The dagger flashed and cut into the open maw of the rotten wolf, ripping up the side of its upper mouth, taking a few of its rotten teeth and drawing up across its cheek and eye before flying overhead and into the distance. Scylla expected a cry of agony, or since it was a creature, at least some sort of pause, but he got nothing of the sort. In fact, the wolf even looked as though it was about to continue biting down on his head without a care. They can't feel pain. This was the one thought he had before he suddenly ducked. His speed plummeted, and he was suddenly about to be stampeded by the pack of wolves. He rolled to the side, but there was another wolf ready and salivating at his scent, ready to rip him to shreds. He activated sudden burst in that moment, exploding to his peak speed in an instant and sliding out of the way of the beast. Luckily, the speed of the wolves might have been high, but their agility seemed low. It was the reason he had managed to catch him off guard with the first maneuver, and why he had also managed to do it this time as well. Their reactions were dull, their intelligence was low, their constitutions should also be relatively weak. However, their strength and speed were off the charts, and they couldn't feel pain. Scylla sent a quick glance toward where his dagger might have landed, but he had already lost it in the thick, wet grass. And after sudden burst had worn off while the wolves reacted, they were already turned toward his direction, ready to pounce again. Luckily, by that point, 3 militiamen alone with Lauren, Morgan, and Alex had finally caught up. The militiamen stormed up with their shields, passing Scylla's by and forming a wall between them. Chapter 74, Corrupt. 150 GTs bonus. They crashed into the charging wolves, their eyes widening as they felt the strength. However, while the wolves were mostly independent, the militiamen worked as a single unit, amplified by not only their armor but their shields as well. The wolves were stalled for but a moment. Holy hell, they're so strong. Alex's voice was tinged with a hint of shock and fear. Scylla's, Morgan called over, tossing a dagger toward him. Scylla's gave a grateful nod, caught the dagger with his telekinesis, and then burst into action again, targeting one of the wolves about to round the solid wall the militiamen had formed. The load was immediately far easier. Scylla felt like the dagger was an extension of himself, an extra limb that he could use as easily as his left and right hands. The wolf snapped its jaws at him, but he dodged to the side, bringing it further from the group before he suddenly attacked. His fist was about to drive through the wolf's snout when a claw swung at him from the side. It was fast, too fast. Scylla rolled his shoulder into it, moving closer to the wolf instead of further away and ruining its play at leverage. He grunted as a sharp, 3-pronged gash was torn across his arm and shoulder, but his constitution wasn't entirely for show at this point either. Just as he took the attack, his dagger swept through the wolf's blind spot, ripping across the tendons of its front paw. The attack was perfectly timed. Although his punch didn't go as planned, his dagger acted perfectly as his third limb, adjusting. The wolf was using one claw to attack when its other front paw suddenly lost its support. Its body tilted forward uncontrollably and its jaw crashed toward the ground as Scylla leapt back. It barely managed to lower its second front paw to the ground to catch itself before it lost its balance entirely, but Scylla didn't give it so much time to keep its bearings. He moved with a flash of his steps and brought down an axe kick right onto the wolf's skull, causing its eyes to bulge out of its sockets, one of them popping out with a sickening wet sound, dangling on a string of flesh and oozing pus. Scylla unleashed a flurry of strikes, his fists landing like hammers as he shifted to the weakened side of the beast. He seemed to want to punch right through the creature, shattering its ribs and caving in an entire side of its body. The wolf tried to lash out with its injured paw, but it couldn't flex its claws without those tendons and ligaments. The attack ended up being easily slapped away by Silas as his dagger shredded apart the tendons in one of its hind legs. Silas' assault was relentless. After the first claw strike that cut him, he seemed to have become untouchable, every strike of his more devastating than the last. He drove another fist into the wolf's skull and it suddenly gave way entirely, crushing it to pieces. It fell limp to the ground and Silas didn't even give it another glance as he charged back to the main battlefield, taking on another. He could feel it inching closer, the flow of battle he was looking for. Ellipsis. The battle ended with everyone gasping for breath. They checked for rewards, but to their disgust, there were none to be had. The result seemed as rotten as the beasts themselves. When they tried to check for genes, they received a prompt that made them all frown. Rotten wolf. Gene detected. Fragmented gene, speed, F. Gene corrupted. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Not only was there only one fragmented gene, something that was completely disproportionate to the strength of the creatures, but the gene was also apparently corrupted. None of them wanted to find out exactly what that meant by testing it on themselves. The worst part was that the troubles didn't end there at all. These wolves were obviously not edible. Their coats couldn't be used for making armors, and worse than that, they couldn't just leave them out here to continue rotting. Not only was the stench absolutely foul, but who knew what sort of diseases they were carrying? Silas was already somewhat worried about the wound he had suffered, even though the claws of the wolves seemed like the only clean part of them. What is a corrupted gene? A corrupted gene can come from an undead creature or a gene processed via an unconventional method. Usually, their theoretical worth doesn't line up with their actual wealth. Their amplification to the body is almost always far more than expected, but the price to pay is heavy as well without adequate preparation. They are a tool often used by the desperate in an attempt to surpass gene and stat limits. But with unearned power, there will always be consequences. Silas' eyes narrowed, looking toward the corpses with a hint of something else in his eye. What is adequate preparation to absorb a corrupt gene? What is adequate preparation to absorb a corrupt gene? Corrupt genes can only be safely absorbed when Hyrule and natural treasures come together. These natural treasures can range from elixirs capable of eliciting a free gene state to legendary genes themselves used as a catalyst. Silas knew that he was insane to even think about it. He was only given one body in this world and he couldn't just erase mistakes he made in it. But he needed to know. Regardless, it wasn't like it was actually achievable right now. A free gene state was the highest gene state there was, one where you could absorb 100% of all the genes you came into contact with without fail. Considering how much trouble Silas had to go through just to get another soft gene state, and one that would only last 3 days as opposed to his current 7-day window at that, one could imagine how rare it was. Chapter 75, Other Side. 225 GT's bonus. A legendary gene spoke for itself. Silas hadn't even seen a bronze gene yet, let alone a legendary one. Also, the madness key didn't specify what it meant by high will either. He thought that he had high will, but did he? Or was his will just high compared to his fellow humans, a species the system didn't even think high of to begin with? Olivia rushed over from the distance. Kasari wasn't allowed to leave the limits of the village without special permissions that she had yet to unlock or earn, so Olivia, her, and the remaining 2 militiamen had taken up arms within the village just in case any of the wolves made it through. We need to deal with the corpses, Olivia said. Leaving them around here will cause problems. I'll have to ask everyone to help to transport them away. I can deal with them, Silas suddenly said. You can. Silas nodded, placing a hand on the wolves and taking them into the madness key. Everyone's eyes widened when they saw that Silas was actually able to store all 6 corpses without an issue. Seems the size of my spatial device is an anomaly, he noted. He had hoped that maybe the village had one of equivalent size but couldn't use it because it was storing something important, like emergency food, maybe. Looks like he wasn't so lucky. Curse, greed has activated. Silas' brows immediately furrowed as the madness key suddenly glowed a faint light on his chest, something that only happened when it was absorbing genes. He sent his mind inside, and suddenly the size began to grow explosively again. In a single instant, it reached 20 cubic meters before coming to a stop. The wolf corpses dissolved and vanished into nothing. What just? His head snapped up and toward a certain direction. He heard it long before he saw it. Another group of rotten wolves was approaching, this time from a completely different direction. There was no way they could make it before this pack crossed into the village. Everyone broke out into a sprint, but it was actually Kasari who reacted first. She was still within the bounds of the village and she saw quite clearly that not everyone would make it in time. A greatsword of exaggerated length appeared in her hands. It must have been at least 1.5 meters long, not to mention at least 8 inches wide at the base before tapering off at the very edge. It was longer than even a traditional longsword, and yet it had a rigidity to it that made Silas cringe. Just how much pressure was on her wrists? There was a glow that enveloped Kasari, and she suddenly accelerated. A sweeping strike cut into the ground and arced upward, slicing through the earth and air as though they were made up of the very same consistency and cutting off the heads of 2 rotten wolves. Their bodies collapsed and were trampled beneath the claws of their companions, but that still slowed the latter group down considerably. Kasari stood red-faced and gasping for air, but the glow around her quickly solidified once again as she seemed to visibly recover. She brandished her sword again, cutting down from above and splitting a stumbling rotten wolf in 2. Everyone seemed to finally catch up at this mountain and they gathered as one, fighting off and killing the final 3 slowly, but surely. Silas looked up, a grave expression marking his brows as what he feared would happen occurred soon afterward. A third group of wolves appeared once more, this time from yet another corner of the village. Without a choice, they broke out into a sprint once more. Ellipsis. Common Arts Enthusiast F. Progress. 422 1/1000ths kicks. 932 1/1000ths punches. 4/10ths fluid attack transitions. Dash. Silas took deep breaths, his body covered in wounds and his chest having gained a bloody claw mark to match his shoulder. This was already the 4th wave of rotten wolves, and the daylight was slowly beginning to wane. If he only had a guess that this was related to the gnolls before, he would be shocked if it wasn't now. By this point, even he was dead tired, let alone everyone else. The only positive was the improvement to the madness key. The now over 20 rotten wolf carcasses he had taken in had allowed it to reach 20 cubic meters, and though it hadn't improved beyond that, the density of madness he could sense from it was on a completely different level. If he just had time, he was certain that he'd at least have a good chance at improving his madness comprehension to bronze mastery, but there just wasn't. Every time he thought it was over, another wave would come. The aim was clear. By the time the gnolls actually appeared, they'd be too dead tired to do anything about them. The question is, though, if they're able to control these wolves, why not attack alongside them? And why send them only 6 at a time? Why not send all 24? There would be no way for us to deal with all of them at once. Silas looked up. The sun was beginning to set. He looked around and could see the gloominess on everyone's faces. Honestly, he would have expected some of the quest takers to leave by now, and maybe he would have also if not for the fact this was Kasari's village. At the same time, he felt some guilt. He had made this decision for everyone, thinking that coming back to the village would give them the best chance. But how had things turned out? Logically, he felt that it was the right decision. But passing judgment as an unaffiliated third party was always easier than if you were a leader, and you had to bear the consequences yourself. His chest heaved, his green eyes glistening as dusk settled in. Finally, his breathing settled down, though the aching of his body didn't. Even so, he was still better off than most of the others. Chapter 76, Saw. 1000 PS bonus. It wasn't just a matter of injuries, but ether and mental fatigue. Silas hadn't been able to use his madness for obvious reasons, and he hadn't used less than madness control greater than either. However, in order to keep up with the large gap in physical stats, everyone else could only use their ether, and without a skill like less than madden meditation greater than, there was no easy way for them to recover it without time and rest. They had already been running on empty after the first 2 skirmishes, and the only way they had managed to continue was because Kasari traded for something she called ether rejuvenation elixirs from the Nexus. But that was the other thing, that being Kasari herself. By now, Silas understood that the great strength she had displayed was as a direct result of her village. She couldn't easily step outside of its bounds, but that didn't come without its benefits either. Unfortunately, those benefits weren't unlimited and using them put a great amount of strain on her body. This was also likely the reason Silas couldn't scan her stats. It wasn't that her mental was higher than his, though that might still be a possibility. It was rather that the boost of being within her city was a great advantage and added extra protection. Silas even had a feeling that this was all within the expectations of whoever was leading the gnolls. Their biggest obstacle wouldn't be him or any combination of the others, but rather Kasari herself, and it was in their best interest that she be on her last legs before they attacked. He looked over. Kasari's dark hair was matted to her forehead, her breathing ragged and rushed. She leaned over on her greatsword, her chest heaving beneath the thick leather armor. Although she was trying her best to keep up that strong front, it was hard even to stand straight any longer. The others looked like they were in worse off condition, having suffered ghastly-looking wounds. But Silas could tell that the one among them who was in the worst condition was definitely Kasari herself. Her body was practically shutting down. Ether, Silas thought to himself. He never really thought about it too much before, but when it flowed through his body, he could almost feel something like a cool liquid. But he could imagine that if you were using too much of it, too quickly, whatever organs it was flowing through would be damaged. Even if Kasari looked fine on the inside, whatever was going on inside of her couldn't be good. Silas looked into the skies as the last rays of sunlight winked out, disappearing over the tall trees. I need to be able to use my madness, or else this won't work. But I can't direct it properly at all, and I obviously can't fight 10 gnolls on my own either. His jaw set. Kasari, how many ether rejuvenation elixirs do you have left? Silas suddenly asked. Kasari looked up with tired eyes. I can still trade for more, but it's dangerous to take too many in a short time. They suggest only 1 an hour. Silas frowned. He had definitely seen Kasari ignore that limit, but he didn't say so. While she wasn't using the elixirs directly, the silvery blue glow that appeared around her when she fought was definitely doing something similar. Obviously, one was an elixir, and the other seemed to be a more natural phenomenon. But judging by Kasari's state, it didn't seem to be much different, honestly. Give me just 1 for now, Silas replied. Kasari nodded and took out 1, passing it to him. Now that she thought about it, Silas was the only one of them to never ask for 1. How was he doing it? Was he relying entirely on gene talents? Silas found a spot and directly plopped down, his mind entering a focused state. He really wanted to improve his madness and even learn how to control and direct it, but he had no inkling of how to do that. However, what he did have an inkling toward was his less than maddened meditation greater than. The skill could do 2 things. First, it helped to refresh his mind, and second, it replenished his ether. The only drawback was that he couldn't use it while he was moving and he had to sit down. But Silas thought of something important. If he could manage to use maddened meditation while he was moving, then his low intelligence would mean much less. This was a thought that had always been in the back of his mind, but there was little he could do to fix it. But then, he had a breakthrough in his telekinesis. He realized then that the visualization method he used to use his telekinesis was very similar to what he used with less than maddened meditation greater than. Less than maddened meditation greater than wasn't an ether circulation method, but it rather put the mind in a particular state of peace and harmony that allowed ether to naturally flow into you, reinvigorating the spirit and one's ether pool. That state of harmony, it reminded Silas a lot of fluid attack transitions. He had been paying close attention to those tickers on his progress. By now, he had successfully risen from 2 to 4 completed circuits, and they were coming faster and faster now. It felt like a state where he knew what was coming before it did, and he reacted accordingly. All of these things seemed to layer atop of one another, each one forming a thin line of connection between them. He felt like he was missing just one more thing, something that was just out of his grasp, and he felt that maybe he'd find it in an unconventional place again. Would this elixir help him? Roar! Silas' eyes snapped open, and he jumped to his feet, his head turning in the direction of the sounds. There was a harsh whistling in his ears that told him his eardrums had just taken some serious damage. But what could possibly make such a loud? Then he saw it. Chapter 77, Decisive. 1200 PS bonus. A group of 10 stormed out from the forest line, their sickly yellow eyes glowing in the dark. 9 of them rode upon rotten wolves, but in the center of those rampaging, 2-meter-tall beasts, there was a monstrosity that stood at 3. It had 2 heads, each fighting over supremacy over which was the rottener of the bunch. Twin-headed rotten wolf, F+. Level, 6. Physical, 65. Mental, 0. Will, 0. Even with this being the case, Scylla's focus was on the man. Or thing, riding its back. Zurog, FF. Level, 1. Physical, 52. Mental, 42. Will, 56. Zurog wielded a bloody scythe, and he exuded something that seemed thicker and beyond anything that Scylla's had ever experienced before, something that reminded him a lot of himself. A comprehension. No, it feels slightly different. Scylla's looked around, and he saw the despair coloring everyone's face. Olivia especially looked as though her body had been completely drained of all its blood. Scylla's understood that this was likely because of her skill. Even if she couldn't see Zurog's stats, she could still see his grade. Before, she had said that she had never even seen an F+ before, but it seemed that this was something even worse than that. Morgan gripped his sword hilt hard, his knuckles having gone completely white. Alex's breathing was ragged and his pupils were completely dilated, likely as a result of a skill. He barely managed to be the best of them due to it, his adrenaline roaring through his veins. Lauren held her sword tightly to herself, fear radiating from her in palpable waves. Silas didn't quite understand why he felt it so clearly, but he was certain it was there. And then there was Kasari. Her pale blue eyes, almost like a stroke of grey-silver in the night, carried a fierceness within it. She looked like she was only one moment away from baring her teeth and growling, herself. And for some reason, Silas wanted to laugh at that sight. Marcus, Kasari barked. Lord, one of the militiamen stood at the ready. You 5 will protect the villages with your lives. Let not a single one of these fuckers through. Yes. The militiamen were nothing if not courageous. They didn't even blink at the order, forming a line of 5 as they blocked the path to the center of the village. Kasari looked at the others. I'm not certain why it is you 3. 4, she corrected herself, haven't run yet, but I have a good idea. Morgan, Alex, and Lauren gripped their weapons tightly, but they didn't respond. I hope that we can all survive and see those thoughts of yours come to fruition. Her eyes landed on Silas, and when she saw the amused light in his eyes, as though he was trying to hold back a laugh, she too seemed to relax. For some reason, she felt that so long as Silas wasn't panicking, maybe things would be fine. Everyone, Silas suddenly said. Trail me by 20 meters. Don't step into that range until I tell you it's all right. After saying these words, Silas shot off. His speed was fast, but not as fast as the oncoming troop of rotten wolves and gnolls. However, it was just enough to get 20 meters away from the group and clear the broken fences of the village. Madness. It rolled out from Silas like a tide. The madness key danced around his neck and his green eyes glowed in the night. Almost immediately, the rotten wolves lost their minds and Silas' gaze sharpened. It was just as he thought. The control these gnolls had over these rotten wolves was incredibly limited. If they could truly control so much, then why only send 6 at a time? And if they could control more than 6, why only charge forward with 10 now? All but the twin-headed rotten wolf bucked their riders off, but that wasn't to say that the twin-headed rotten wolf escaped the fate of madness. Its mental and will was 0, it had no capacity to resist Silas at all. Instead, Zurog was able to maintain his balance even with the wolf going wild beneath him. Confusion colored the yellow eyes of the gnolls as the rotten wolves actually began to attack one another and their riders. Then the madness hit Zurog. He felt like his mind was being slowly corrupted and his eyes even began to go red for a moment before he managed to shake himself free, the shock even more evident in his eyes now. A maddened brawl broke out as Silas kept his distance. There was no use in getting close now and maybe causing one of them to take out their rage on him. He realized that even when his madness wasn't strong enough to make people completely lose their minds, it did make it hard for them to focus, and it enhanced the deepest emotions. Back when his madness enveloped the group, Alex had just gotten the bone axe from him and his emotions spilled over as though he was ready to anthropomorphize it. Lauren was the most jittery of the group, and she completely shut down. The more intelligent a creature was, the more specific and unique their reaction to madness would be, so long as they couldn't resist the effects, that is. For rotten wolves who had no resistance at all, the result was obvious. They didn't even fight as hard as Little and Middle Madness had. They immediately lost what small bits of rationality they had, lashing out at everything that was close to them, even the riders they had only just been allowing to use them. Zurog realized that it had to be Silas who was doing this. It was unbelievable to him, but he was intelligent enough to know what he had to do. Silas' gaze sharpened as Zurog suddenly swung his battle axe down, severing both heads of his rotten wolf and leaping toward his direction. Decisive. Chapter 78, Range. This was the only thought that Silas could have before Zurog was already upon him, or rather. His bloody scythe was. Silas barely managed to lean back, dodging out of the way, but a swing came instantaneously. Zurog was fast. His legs were like their own pumping engines. Just to make it to Silas so fast, he had to cross over a dozen meters in what felt like a single blink. Much like Kasari, he seemed to treat the ground as though it was air, slicing through it with the same ease as the wind. The difference was that he didn't seem to need to use ether at all. Silas was immediately at a disadvantage. The polyam of the scythe was at least 2 meters from end to end, and the blade itself had an exaggerated bend, along with a ghastly serrated edge. Compared to Silas' arms and even legs, the difference was too large. Luckily, Silas had already shored up this weakness. A dagger glistened through the night, appearing within Zurog's guard and at his throat in an instant. Beneath the amplification of madness, Silas' telekinesis imposed a strength and speed of 75 while its acceleration was near instant. Zurog leaned back, slamming the butt of his scythe into the ground in an attempt to keep his balance and dodge that at the same time. He had obviously been observing the battles from earlier in the day and knew of Silas' telekinesis. He had been waiting for it the entire time. His mouth suddenly opened and Silas barely had time to sense a rush of ether before Zurog unleashed a puff of black smoke from his lips just as the dagger floated above his nose. The dagger was under Silas' control the entire time. He had been ready to pull it back like it was a jab, but Zurog's reaction was quick, too quick. The dagger suddenly crumbled to ash, the corrosive black fog wilting it and crushing it like dried leaves. Silas rushed forward, trying to take advantage of the Null Elite's imbalance, but the latter shot out a kick that nearly caught him in his chest. Silas crossed his arms to block, feeling a tremendous force push him backward. He gritted his teeth, holding it in and digging his heels into the ground. He knew that he couldn't retreat too far. If he did, he would be forced to release his madness and his ability to control the flow of battle would plummet. Zurog recovered in an instant, a crooked grin twisting his snout as he followed up, pulling his scythe out from the ground and plunging into another assault. Silas dodged one way, then the other. Every time he tried to close the gap, Zurog had a perfect counter waiting for him, the latter's skill in battle clearly on a tier higher than his own. Suddenly, Silas sensed ether circulating again, and he immediately went on high alert. Zurog opened his mouth again and Silas immediately dove to the side. If that caustic fog could do what it had done to his dagger, he didn't want it to touch even an inch of him. But it was a feint. The butt of Zurog's scythe drove into Silas' side just as he dove. Silas coughed out a breath, feeling his constitution almost giving way beneath the strength of the strike. He sprawled across the ground, gliding across the earth on a knee and elbow before he barely managed to stand to his feet, rolling out of the way of another strike. Black fog oozed off the scythe, leaving trails in its wake. Silas, Olivia called out and threw a dagger toward the battlefield as hard as she could. Silas barely registered it. It was impossible to visualize without eyes on the weapon, and in the darkness, it was even harder. However, he heard the whistle and the thwack as it pierced into the ground not far away. He dodged out of the way of another strike and looked in the direction of the sound. He didn't spot it immediately and was forced to dodge again. Zurog was absolutely relentless, his attacks flowing freely from one to another. The drawback of only being able to use his fists as weapons was biting back hard right at this moment. No, it's because I lack the skill. Silas' green irises oozed an eerie light as he timed his movement. He dodged another strike and suddenly planted his leg hard. Sudden burst. He immediately closed the distance, entering the range of Zurog's scythe and striking out with a fist that carried everything he had. A mad cackle came from Zurog. "You fool! My scythe is the strongest in this range." The voice was unexpected. Filled with gravel and malice, it rumbled beneath the night sky, spreading out almost like the very same caustic black fog. The concave side of the blade glistened behind Scylla's neck and Zurog suddenly took a step back, pulling his scythe back and toward it. Even if Scylla's punched him now, he would only be helping his momentum. Signals of danger seemed to flood Scylla's body. He could almost feel the whistling wind as the Gnoll Elite moved to take his head, as though chopping tall grass. There was no other choice. Less than madness control greater than. The world slowed around Scylla's, and he seemed to gain an extra second to react to the world around him. His fist landed with a dull boom. He could feel Zurog's flesh distort beneath his knuckles and the whistling of the scythe behind him coming with an even faster speed. All at once Scylla's ducked, using his telekinesis to press up on the scythe and push himself down even faster. A whistling wind caught his hair and just barely missed his scalp. He suddenly released the pressure on Zurog's scythe and the latter stumbled only just a bit, but it was enough for Scylla's to regain his bearings. That's right, my telekinesis doesn't just have to be used on myself or my items. Chapter 79, More Fluid. Even though it was currently very limited on heavier objects, and that would likewise apply to weapons being wielded with great strength as well as that was even worse than just a heavy weapon, that didn't mean it was useless. Zurog regained his balance, snarling. He could still feel that heavy punch, and it had jarred him quite seriously. Behind him, his rotten wolves and companions were still ripping each other apart. His heart was truly bleeding. The entire Gnoll village had been wiped out by these people. He could feel a dense rage bubbling up within him. Unbeknownst to Zurog and even Scylla's, madness had inexplicably taken hold. Zurog roared and slashed out, his ether spinning freely as a blade jetted out toward Scylla's. Scylla's eyes widened. He hadn't been expecting this at all. Sudden burst. He rushed to the side, feeling the ache in his body after using the gene talent so soon after the first time. At the same time, he could feel that less than madness control greater than was already running out, and he didn't feel any closer to winning this battle. Zurog released another wild strike and Scylla's felt that he was beginning to retreat too much. Even if Kassarai and the other retreated, what about the militiamen and the villagers? If his madness enveloped them, there was no telling what could happen. Focus. Think. Even though he told himself this, he had no idea how to deal with this situation. All this time, he had been relying on fighting entertainment he had watched back on Earth to barely inform his fighting style. But nowhere in those matches would there be a weaponless man going up against Apollyon like this, and definitely not a side of all things. Even worse, by now he had completely lost track of the dagger that Olivia had thrown. He still knew around where it had landed, but no matter how much he looked for it in that region, he found nothing. However, he finally found some hope to cling on to. He realized that Zurog's attacks had become more dangerous, but he was even more focused on Scylla's than he had been before. As Scylla's made a subtle attempt to lead him in a different direction, the Gnoll Elite unhesitatingly followed. Fatigue was beginning to take hold and less than madden control greater than was moments away from not having any ether to draw on. Scylla slipped past another attack and downed the elixir that Kassarai had given him. He suddenly felt a wild rush of ether flood his body and his eyes widened. It was more than he could handle. It was only in Felikir, so he hadn't thought much about it, but Scylla's had forgotten that his intelligence was incredibly weak. He felt a bulge in his stomach area, but luckily it didn't feel too dangerous. He could only let the ether leak out of him, his body clearly incapable of handling anything more than this. This is. Scylla's felt something odd. It was like the reverse of less than madden meditation greater than. The ether had nowhere to go, and so it naturally flowed out of him. But when he used less than madden meditation greater than, it was as though the opposite was created, almost as though his body was suddenly the point of low concentration it needed to come to. A scythe's blade appeared before Scylla's. With his less than madness control greater than still in effect, he found it just as easy to dodge, his control over himself at a peak. His eyes seemed to glaze over as he comprehended something. Skill less than madden meditation greater than has evolved into less than maddened enlightenment greater than. Less than maddened enlightenment greater than has reached fragmented mastery, maddened enlightenment, FF+. You are deeply in tune with the madness of your ancestors. It helps you to focus, relax, and form a oneness with the world. Understanding yourself is a form of peace, but understanding your place in the world makes you enlightened. Your understanding of less than madness control greater than has deepened, less than madness control greater than has reached bronze mastery. Scylla's head ducked under a scythe's blade and he suddenly felt like he could see with far more than his eyes. He looked in the direction of the fallen dagger again. His eyes still saw nothing, but for some reason, he could feel it. His telekinesis tugged, and the dagger rushed over with 75 speed. Madness, which had been about to run out as well, suddenly snapped back into focus and his mind felt like it had just expanded. Zurog couldn't even react as a dagger suddenly plunged deeply into his back. Unfortunately, there was armor there, much thicker and more substantial than anything the other gnolls had been wearing. Even so, Silas didn't regret it. The sudden attack from the back sent a spike of fear through the gnoll elite, whose eyes suddenly cleared somewhat as he looked for his attacker. Taking advantage, Silas pressed his advantage, closing in and drawing a hook across the gnoll's snout. Zurog's teeth flew and blood splattered, but he reacted quickly, his ether rumbling again. Faint. Silas concluded this without the slightest change in expression and unloaded an elbow across Zurog's snout before unleashing a knee right into his crotch. One of Zurog's hands released from his scythe in an attempt to swipe at Silas while his scythe pulled back once again. The same trick won't work twice. Zurog seemed to have already forgotten about the dagger because when it suddenly moved, pulling out from his back and slashing against his wrists, his cry of agony was as much of pain as it was of surprise. His fingers loosened the grip as his scythe fell to the ground, and his body became a punching bag. A barrage of fists and kicks, each one flowing seamlessly from the last, bore down on the gnoll elite. The feeling of rotten flesh and putrid blood flying through the air seemed to fuel Silas all the more. Faster, sharper, more fluid. Tail whip. His shin collided with the side of the gnoll elite's head, causing sprays of blood to flow. Chapter 80, That Face. 300 GT's bonus. Ether moved within Zurog again, a last-ditch effort. But it was clear that he had wasted too much of it earlier, and while Silas was seemingly a funnel for ether in the surroundings, Zurog had no such ability. It was much too late. Silas' fist moved like the wind, the darkness not seeming to bother him as much any longer as he drove a fist right through the gnoll elite's head. At the same time, his dagger drove into the back of his skull. The two-pronged attack skewered the gnoll. The last of his strength sputtered as he fell to his knees, his eyes filled with disbelief up until the moment they finally dimmed. Silas stood there, huffing deep breaths. This was it, the flow of battle. 10 out of 10 fluid attack transitions. Silas tilted his head up to the skies, breathing heavily. Blood trickled down his body from various wounds, but oddly enough his scorned wraps always seemed to remain dry. The moon was a beautiful crescent, and the stars were twinkling in their own beautiful orchestra. It was the kind of sight you couldn't normally see on Earth, at least not where he lived. But even so, it felt so benign compared to the feelings rushing through his body right at this moment. By this point, he was certain that he was some kind of deviant. He wasn't sure what was so fun about putting your life on the line constantly, but maybe he should have known that he had these sorts of proclivities the moment he clicked yes. He could faintly hear Kasari making a victory speech and the celebration of the villagers, but he tuned it all out as he basked in the feeling. I know that face. Silas didn't know how long he stood there, but the voice came so suddenly that he was almost startled. Only after he looked over did he realize it was Kasari. We need to go clear the gnoll village, Silas suddenly said. Don't try to change the subject, Silas, Kasari said with an almost creepy grin, as though she had caught him doing something dirty. If you had a mirror here, you'd probably be jacking off to your own reflection. Don't think that just because you're not wearing a shit-eating grin that I don't know what you're thinking. Silas wasn't even surprised by the crude words. She had a model's looks and a sailor's mouth. It was probably Newton's fourth law that Kasari had to cuss at least once for every sentence she spoke in a day. Accusing me of such things when you click yes to is kind of hypocritical, don't you think? He wasn't looking at her expression, so he didn't see the odd look in her eyes when he said that. What he did hear, though, was her quippy response. Deflecting again, well, I can't say you don't deserve it this time, just don't get in over your head. Silas finally sent her a glance and blinked. You look tired. She did. Her hair had lost all its volume due to the sweat and blood, and her eyes seemed to have lost some of its usual brightness. In response, though, she rolled her eyes. You still haven't learned how to talk to women. I believe the words you were looking for are, you look perfect. Silas actually chuckled a bit, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He looked her up and down and shook his head. No, you definitely look like a hot mess. Kasari flipped her sweat-matted hair. Emphasis on hot, thank you very much. Now go get some rest yourself. We're in no state to raid a village right now. Although there shouldn't be any other gnolls, who knows what's out there. Silas shook his head. We can't risk that. There was something very odd about the leader, especially those zombie wolves too. I think the secret is in or near the village. Kasari hesitated. She really just wanted to sleep and her mind was filled with worry about who she'd even put on guard duty for the night. All the militiamen and the quest takers were completely spent. She really didn't want to deal with this right now, especially since the main threat was gone. But I'll go. It isn't a problem. I'll be back before the night is through, so long as everything goes well. Kasari bit her lip. Are you sure? Yes. She hesitated before she steeled herself. Then, are you willing to join Castlemaine? As an official member, I mean. There's a system that allows the recruitment of adventurers. It's a slightly different path than the usual villager spawning path. I think that's what the others want to do too. Her voice trailed off. It was clear to her that Morgan, Lauren, and Alex saw this as more than just a quest. They saw it as hope to not have to spend every second looking over their shoulders. This was the real reason they had stayed. They really didn't want to have to go back. Castlemaine was the #1 ranked human territory. If they didn't join her, then who would they join? I would love to, but I can't, Silas replied. Kasari's expression dimmed a bit. But what she didn't expect was to suddenly see Silas' status screen in front of her. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage. Level, 0. Titles, A Flexible Will, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, A Patient Stalker, F. Physical, 50. Greater than Strength, 50. Greater than Constitution, 50. Greater than Dexterity, 50. Greater than Speed, 50. Mental, 47. Greater than Intelligence, 10. Greater than Wisdom, 10. Greater than Charisma, 122, Will, 94. Luck, 1. Skills, Madness Control, FF+, Basic Scouting, F, Maddened Enlightenment, FF+. Comprehensions, Madness, FFF. Gene State, Soft. Fragmented Genes, Grimblade Lineage, F8, Dexterity, F6, Constitution, F6, Strength, F. Common Genes, 3, Speed, F3, Strength, F2, Constitution, F3, Dexterity, F. Gene Talents, Blade Aura, Unranked, Sudden Burst, F, Tail Whip, F.